talked about what the Bible is. We have discussed its trustworthiness and how to read it. We've gone through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. And now we come to a new section of the Old Testament referred to as biblical historiography. Remember when we considered the orderings of the Old Testament, that in the Hebrew order, after the first 5 books are the prophets, and in our English order, how they're organized is after the first 5 books, then you have historiography. So that's what we're going to begin to discuss today. And this lecture is just going to be a mere overview of the more historiographical works, and we'll discuss kind of what that means here in just a second. But I'm excited to go over this with you. Let's go ahead and get started. So, overview of biblical historiography. A significant portion of the Old Testament is historiographical, meaning it records actual events that happened in the past. Now, historiographical, to refer to only some books like Joshua through Kings as historiographical, is a little misleading because all of Genesis, a lot of Exodus, some of Leviticus, and a lot of Numbers is historiographical. That is, it records actual events that happened in the past. But Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and Kings, and other books as well, like think of Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they are predominantly historiographical. They are recording historical events. Now, this raises a really important question about how biblical historiography works. Biblical historiography is much different than how modern historians do history. It's maybe not, maybe that's the wrong wording. They're not completely different, though there is a difference. And that difference comes in really really the two areas that distinguish biblical historiography. And that first one is that biblical historiography is chronologically sensitive. You can see it's chronologically sensitive and theologically interpreted. But first, it is very chronologically selective. And here's what I mean by that. Each chapter has been chosen within a historiographical work to serve a larger literary end. So let's think about this for a second. So 1st and 2nd Kings, which we'll outline and we'll go through here in a few lectures. 1st Kings begins with really the death of David and the beginning of the construction of the tabernacle, the temple rather, in Jerusalem. And that would have occurred with the death of David approximately like 970 BC. That's when Solomon takes over, is when David dies. Well, that's when 1st Kings begins. And 2nd Kings concludes with the destruction of Jerusalem and one of the Davidic kings in Babylon. Okay, so that's about 400 years. I'm not a mathematician. Give or take, it's like 400 years, right? Okay, and I have here it's 350 years, but if you look at, like I said, like 970 to like 586, okay, 350, 400 years. But it covers centuries in 47 chapters. Okay, if that's the case, right, and you're trying to tell a history of Israelite kingship and what happened in Jerusalem, how the temple was destroyed, by necessity, you're going to have to be selective in the chapters that you choose. And you will choose chapters based off of a larger literary goal that you're trying to accomplish. So think of it this way. So Kings, for it to record at the very end the destruction of Jerusalem, implies that it's probably written in general, put together after the destruction of Jerusalem. So that means whoever put Kings together, say it was Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, etc., they're probably tailoring their history of it within that they've put together in Kings to explain how Jerusalem ended up being destroyed. Okay? How Jerusalem ended up being destroyed, but then also, is there any hope for us now that we're back in the land? Is there a David ever going to come again? So these sort of questions are going to shape how the book is then put together, because you just by necessity have to be selective in what you're trying to accomplish. Here's another way to think about it. So if I was to tell a history of my day. So like I like to, at the end of the day, write down some thoughts, kind of like journaling thoughts. Well, I wouldn't have enough space to write down everything I did during the day or every thought that I had. Instead, I'm going to highlight the major things or write down the most significant things for what I'm thinking about. That's how history works. That's how biblical historiography works. It's not, and it's the same with other books as well. Think of Genesis, which is predominantly historiographical. As we talked about, Genesis records thousands of years in 50 chapters. Okay, that means that each of those chapters have been selected for a reason, and they serve a larger literary telos. And that leads us to this second component of biblical historiography, and that is historiography in the Bible is theologically interpreted. And that means that the historians, those who are putting these works together, they interpret history through a theological lens. Consider this example from 2 Kings 23. Moreover, Josiah put the mediums and the necromancers, witches, right, idolaters, and the household gods and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law. That's probably the book of Deuteronomy, that were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul, with all his might, according to the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. Still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh, he was one of the southern kings, had provoked him. So look at this example here. So you have verse 24, which is a clear, just historical telling of what Josiah did. He put away all of the things that Yahweh hates. And he did it for the reason to establish the words of probably Deuteronomy. Okay, so that's just a clear historical reality. And then you look at verses 25 and 26, and you have a theological interpretation of Josiah's kingship. Verse 25, there was no king like Josiah. There was no king who followed followed Yahweh like Josiah. But yet the Lord still did what he set out to do. So the biblical historiography is theologically interpreted. The kings are judged according to theological criteria. Now, that does not mean that these events did not happen. Just because they're theologically interpreted does not mean that they didn't happen the way the author said they do. It's just this is just good history. The historians are serving this larger literary end, explaining why certain things have come to pass. So again, biblical historiography, it's chronologically selective, and it is also theologically interpreted. It outlines real events that really happened for a larger literary end, and in doing so, the historians also interpret those events through theological criteria of what has already been set out in Scripture. And so we're going to go ahead now and move to the book of Joshua, and we'll see Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and how this will be worked out in due time.